You've probably heard it before. Give 10% of your income to the church, or you're disobeying God. Maybe you've even felt guilty for not tithing, wondering if you're missing out on blessings. But what if I told you the New Testament never actually commands Christians to tithe? That's right. The idea that tithing is mandatory might be one of the biggest misunderstandings in modern Christianity. Let's break it down together. 1. The tithe trap. Why this debate matters. Imagine working overtime to make ends meet, then being told you're robbing God if you do not give 10% of that hard-earned money. It's crushing. And it's happening to thousands of believers every week. Churches often quote Malachi 3 verse 8, "Will a man rob God?" But here's the problem that was spoken to Israelites under the law of Moses, not to Christians under grace. Think about how many sermons you've heard where Malachi 3 verse 8 is used like a spiritual guilt trip. Bring the whole tithe, or you're stealing from God. But here's what they rarely mention. That passage was specifically addressing Israelites who were neglecting temple worship while still expecting God's blessings. It was not a blanket command for all believers throughout history. In fact, when you study the Old Testament carefully, you'll notice tithing was not just about money. It included crops, livestock, and even specific festival offerings. The modern church has cherry-picked the money part while ignoring the rest of the system. And consider this. If tithing was so essential, why did not Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament, ever command it? He planted churches across the Roman Empire, yet his letters mention voluntary giving, not mandatory tithing. When he collected funds, it was for famine relief, Acts 11 verse 29, not to pay for church buildings or pastoral salaries. That tells us something crucial about New Covenant generosity. 2. What Jesus actually said about money. Jesus talked about money more than almost any other topic, but he never commanded tithing. Not once. Instead, he called for radical generosity, like the widow who gave her last 2 coins. He exposed the hypocrisy of religious leaders who tithed mint and cumin but neglected justice and mercy. If tithing was so crucial, why did not Jesus make it clear? Jesus' most famous teaching on money was not about tithing. It was the story of the rich young ruler. Notice what happened. The man claimed to have kept all the commandments, including tithing, yet Jesus told him to sell everything. Why? Because tithing had become his way of avoiding true surrender. That's the danger of reducing generosity to a percentage. It can become a religious checkbox that makes us feel righteous while our hearts remain unchanged. And look at how Jesus praised the poor widow. He did not say, "See, she tithed." He celebrated her sacrificial giving. She gave all she had, which was far more than 10%. This reveals a key truth. God measures generosity by sacrifice, not by percentages. A billionaire giving 10% is not necessarily more generous than a single mom giving $20 if that $20 represents her last grocery money. 3. The surprising freedom in New Testament giving. Here's the good news. You're not under a 10% rule. The New Testament replaces tithing with something far more powerful, cheerful, voluntary giving. 2 Corinthians 9 verse 7 says God loves a joyful giver, not a guilt-driven one. That means you can give out of love, not obligation. This freedom does not mean giving less. It might mean giving more. I know a construction worker who felt called to support a homeless ministry. He could not afford 10%, so he gave 5% plus his Saturdays serving meals. That's New Testament giving, not a rigid rule, but a spirit-led response to need. Paul's instructions in 2 Corinthians 8-9 are revolutionary. He did not set a percentage. He said the Macedonian churches gave beyond their ability. This is light years away from the modern tithe or be cursed mentality. It's about joyful participation in God's work, not religious obligation. 4. The uncomfortable truth about modern tithing. Many churches depend on tithing to fund their budgets, and that's where things get messy. When pastors pressure people to tithe, it often has more to do with keeping the lights on than biblical obedience. I've seen families go into debt because they believed God would open the windows of heaven if they tithed, only to face financial ruin. I spoke with a pastor who confessed his church's budget was built on tithing theology. When attendance dropped, he was told to preach harder on Malachi 3 rather than re-examine their spending. That's when he realized they'd created a system dependent on guilt, not grace. Many churches operate this way. They need the 10% model to sustain salaries, mortgages, and programs. But is that biblical? The early church did not tithe. They shared everything. They sold property to meet needs. Contrast that with modern churches where 80% of budgets often go to buildings and staff. I'm not saying those are bad, but when the budget depends on pressuring people to tithe, we've drifted from New Testament principles. 5. How Paul redefined generosity. Paul never collected tithes. He took up offerings for specific needs, like famine relief. He told the Corinthians to give whatever they decided in their hearts, not 10%. That's a game changer. It means your giving should be thoughtful, not automatic. Paul's approach to giving was need-based, not percentage-based. When he collected for the Jerusalem church, 1 Cor. 16:1-3, he did not say, give 10%. He said, set aside a sum each week. The amount was up to each person. This is radically different from the one-size-fits-all tithe. Notice also that Paul never promised financial returns to givers. Prosperity preachers love to say, give to get, but Paul simply said generosity results in thanksgiving to God. The reward is not earthly wealth, it's participating in God's work. That's a much richer motivation than pay to be blessed. 6. The real key to biblical abundance. Generosity is not about percentages, it's about the heart. When you give freely, you step into a supernatural cycle of blessing. But here's what most people miss, that blessing is not always financial. Sometimes it's joy, peace, or seeing lives changed. I've seen this play out in my own life. Years ago, I gave 10% religiously while ignoring my neighbor's electricity about to be cut off. God convicted me. My obedience was actually disobedience because it lacked love. Now, I give less to my church but more to people in crisis, and I've never felt more aligned with God's heart. Biblical abundance is not about your bank account. It's about your capacity to love. When you stop seeing giving as a transaction and start seeing it as worship, everything changes. You notice needs you never saw before. You become more creative, giving time, skills, or even just listening to someone lonely. That's the real windows of heaven blessing. 7. What about Malachi 3? Let's settle this. Yes, Malachi 3 promises blessings for tithers, but it was a covenant with ancient Israel. The new covenant does not include that same transactional promise. Instead, we're invited into a relationship where giving flows from gratitude, not fear. Malachi 3 was part of the Mosaic covenant, which included over 600 commands. We do not sacrifice animals or observe Jubilee years anymore. Why single out tithing? If we're going to apply Malachi 3 literally, we'd also have to bring grain offerings. You never hear sermons on those verses because they do not fit the modern tithing agenda. The New Testament fulfillment of tithing is Christ himself. Hebrews 7 explains that Abraham tithed to Melchizedek, a Christ figure, showing that the ultimate tithe is our surrender to Jesus. When we focus on percentages, we miss the bigger picture. Everything we have already belongs to God. 8. The danger of a tithe or bust mentality. I've met people who tithe religiously but ignore the poor in their own neighborhoods. That's backwards. Jesus said whatever we do for the least of these, we do for him. If your 10% is going to a building fund while people starve, it's time to rethink. A friend pastors a small church where members tithe faithfully but drive past homeless camps daily. He challenged them. What if we took half our tithe money and used it to feed people right now? Some resisted. They wanted their giving to count at church. That's the tithe or bust trap. It can make us more committed to an institution than to people. Jesus reserved his harshest words for religious people who tithed while neglecting justice. He did not say stop tithing, he said do both. But if we only do the measurable 10% and call it obedience, we're missing his point entirely. 9. How to give like a New Testament Christian. Start by asking, what's God leading me to give? Pray over your finances. Support needs that move your heart, whether that's your local church, a missionary, or a single mom struggling to pay rent. This is the kind of giving that changes the world. Here's a practical way to start. Instead of automatically writing a tithe check, pray, God, where do you want this money? You might feel led to support a missionary, help a struggling family, or even tip a waiter generously. That's New Testament giving, responsive, relational, and led by the Spirit. I know a couple who allocates their giving budget monthly. Some goes to church, some to a pregnancy center, and they always keep cash ready for spontaneous needs. They say this approach has made giving exciting rather than dutiful. That's the freedom Paul described, not grudging obligation but cheerful participation. 10. The ultimate test of your generosity. Here's the bottom line. If you're giving out of love, you're doing it right. If you're giving out of guilt, it's time to pause. God does not want your money, He wants your heart. And when He has your heart, the money will follow. So what do you think? Does this change how you see tithing? Let me know in the comments. I read everyone. And if this video helped you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Together, let's break free from religious pressure and discover the joy of real generosity.